Hi guys! So this here is a video I've wanted to make for a while, and I just feel like now is really the most perfect time for it because thanks to the Barbie movie, a lot of people are discovering or even rediscovering the wonderful world of buying and collecting dolls as an adult. And doll collecting is not really what I would call the most inaccessible hobby. Like, if you want to buy a doll, you can just go to Target or Walmart and buy one. But it can still be very overwhelming. There's so many options, so many things to keep track of, to remember, to consider. There might be all these terms you don't really understand, and it seems like everyone but you has it all figured out. I fully 100% understand what that feels like. And I do see people who are excited about doll collecting and they kind of go all in, full force, no holds barred, and it overwhelms them and they get burned out really quickly. So I wanted to make a video, a very beginner-friendly video. Something that's hopefully easy to reference and just serves as well a beginner's guide to doll collecting, obviously. Because doll collecting is a pretty niche hobby, so that means a lot of the know-how, the ins and outs, they're not super readily available, and you just really have to pick it up through experience and trial and error. So I did take notes of specific areas I wanted to touch upon. So in this video, I'm going to go over reasons to start collecting dolls, where to start, some important terms and words you'll need to know, dealing with stigma, display, cleaning, and maintenance, and finally, most important, budgeting. All things that I think are important to talk about when you're first starting out. So, first order of business. Why listen to me, right? What do I know? Well, first off, I'm a Virgo, so that means I'm always right and I always know exactly what I'm talking about. But on a serious note, I've been collecting dolls since I was 12 or 13, and I mean not just buying dolls. I've bought dolls my entire life, but that's when I started actively collecting. So I do have experience. And I'm not making this video as a way for me to tell you exactly what to do. No, this is an advice video. It's meant to be taken very lightly, and whether you follow or not is ultimately up to you. Second order of business, I need to clarify that this video is very exclusive to collecting fashion dolls. If you're more into like antique dolls or ball-jointed dolls, maybe some of it could still apply, but I can really only speak to what I know, and that's fashion dolls. Hi, editing me here. One thing I did forget to mention is that I made this video with the intention of targeting specifically fellow adult collectors. So a lot of this is going off the assumption that the person watching this is an adult with their own space, their own income. If you are watching and you are younger or still living with your parents and you don't have your own income, I think a lot of the advice here can still be very useful, but you have to keep in mind that it is going to be a little more difficult for you. So I think that covers my intro. Let's just go ahead and get into it. This is Darling Dolls, Beginner's Guide to Doll Collecting. Chapter 1. Why should I collect dolls? Because you want to. Chapter 2. Okay, for realsies, yes, because you want to. That's the only reason you need. You don't need anyone else on this earth to validate your purchasing decisions. That is one of the joys of being an adult. That said, if you do have a specific reason, that's fine too. I do think quantifying that can be useful if you're the type of person who does feel like they need a justification, because I get it. Buying toys as an adult, for a lot of people, it's not the most natural thing to do, and maybe you just need that extra push. But it can be tricky because it can turn into making excuses for your collecting. And when you feel like you need to justify every single purchase, it seriously sucks a lot of the joy out of it. So at the end of the day, make sure that you are collecting for you and yourself first and foremost. For some people, collecting dolls is very soothing and healing. It's nostalgic. For other people, it's fulfilling. Maybe they're buying things they couldn't have when they were a child for one reason or another. And for other people, they just like the aesthetic and they like being surrounded by dolls. Each and every one of these is equally as valid as the others, but they are not mandatory. No reason or justification or excuse is mandatory. Now, that said, I do think we need to be a little careful when we factor mental health into it, especially the whole healing my inner child thing. Again, it's fine, absolutely nothing against people who find comfort in that, but doll collecting is a very consumerist hobby. There's no way around that. And I think putting the onus of healing onto items you have to pay for, in a lot of cases you have to pay quite a lot for, can be slippery and it can lead to some really bad habits, so do be conscious of that. This is the shortest chapter because obviously I cannot decide your reasoning for you. That's a pretty personal thing, but I did want to make sure to at least put it out there that at the end of the day, you don't need a reason. You buy that doll because you want it, and that's perfectly 100% fine. For real now, chapter 2. Where do I start? So this is where it gets a little trickier, because when it comes to starting your collection, truly, there are so many options. Often when someone's made the decision to start doll collecting, they already have a pretty good idea of what they want or what they're looking for, but that's not always the case. If you're someone who feels pretty overwhelmed by the options and you just aren't really sure which brands are right for you, my advice is to start pretty cheap. Before you take that big leap, go to Walmart or Target and just look at the more budget-friendly options. If you want just as basic and inexpensive and as beginner-friendly as a doll can possibly get, Barbie fashionistas are a great choice. They're almost always well-stocked, there's a lot to choose from, so you can pick one that stands out to you the most, and they're also the most what you see is what you get kind of doll. No gimmicks, no surprises, you know exactly what you're buying. And once you have that doll, just sit with her for a while. I use the term connecting with a doll, but I realize that might sound strange to newcomers, but just brush her hair, maybe buy her an extra outfit and dress her up, display her in the perfect spot, and slowly but surely you may realize you'll want another one. And that, my friend, is when you've become a collector. Now, when it comes to specific brands, there are pros and cons to all of them, and it purely comes down to personal preference and to what kind of experience you're looking for. I'm going to go through some of the ones that are most popular at the time of me filming this to give you an idea. But really, what you get out of a doll brand is another thing that is just not totally set in stone. It can be different for everyone. So if any of these sound like they appeal to you, from here I would do research on them. Just Google a database, look at the fandom wikis, websites like Dollect, Lookin' Bratz, Monster High merch, websites like that. Go through the releases and start deciding which specific dolls you want. Anyways, obviously the most ubiquitous of all is Barbie. Barbie is a good choice for beginners because she has dolls at every single price range, every level, and she's incredibly easy to acquire. Barbie is also great when it comes to diversity in the dolls. There's tons of different skin tones, there's just different body types, and hundreds upon hundreds of unique faces, too. Some people like the idea of finding a doll that looks like them, and Barbie is absolutely the best place to start for that. And what you see on the toy shelves is not all Barbie has to offer. The Barbie brand frequently puts out more expensive dolls aimed specifically at adult collectors, and I'll get more into the specifics of collector dolls later. These are usually a little harder to get a hold of, but not at all impossible. Barbie is not known for being the most exciting or the most elaborate doll brand, but she is by far the most accessible. Alternative to Barbie, there's Monster High. Specifically, the third generation is what's on shelves right now. A Monster High is a lot more character focused and relies on secondary media for promotion, such as music videos and the cartoon that's running on Nickelodeon. So, if you're someone who enjoys like a fandom aspect, who enjoys talking about characters and stories and relationships, then Monster High is definitely a good bet. A Monster High is great if you're looking for interesting characters and fun designs, but the quality of the dolls, like their clothes, fabric, and hair, it's not the best on the market. If you're someone who doesn't have like a huge frame of reference, you may not even notice, but there's definitely some shortcuts taken in their manufacturing. Now, if you're someone who wants a more fashion-forward experience, I'd look towards brands that are manufactured by MGA. Oh, Barbie and Monster High are both by Mattel, by the way. MGA is Mattel's bitter rival, and they're in constant competition trying to outsell each other. And that's important to know because some collectors have like really fierce brand loyalty, but I do not recommend factoring that into your decision, personally. Anyways, MGA dolls are known for being a lot higher quality. They're usually pretty intricate and use a lot of high quality fabrics and are also a lot more conscious of like current fashion trend. The pricing for MGA products also tends to be really inconsistent. Sometimes they're way more expensive than Mattel, and sometimes they're around the same price. MGA dolls also tend to have really exaggerated proportions and are way more stylized, which personally I love, but I find that a lot of collectors are kind of put off by. So for the most prominent MGA brands, there's of course Bratz. The Bratz on shelves now are mainly reproductions of older dolls, so it's actually a pretty good place to start with them. They've also been doing collaborations with designers to make collector's dolls, so they're definitely a brand that is now catering pretty specifically to an older audience. Also, LOL OMG, which is a spin-off of the LOL Surprise brand. These are some of my all-time favorites. A lot of people don't like the faces, and I get it, but they have such seriously strong designs. They're just so much fun. There's not a lot of background to these. There's like movies and a web series, but these are first and foremost about the designs and the fashions and not much else. Another big MGA brand is Rainbow High. The core concept of these is basically really just that each character has a color. A big thing with Rainbow High is that a lot of the fashions take inspiration from real-life designers and fashion pieces, and of every brand I've talked about so far, I think Rainbow High is probably the most fashionable in the sense of like actually taking into account current trends and fashion styles. They can also be really expensive though. Not always. Sometimes they're pretty reasonably priced, but sometimes they're just not, and they're like ludicrously expensive for no reason. And those are like the big five, but to touch upon a few others, Disney princesses are a big one. There's the Disney princess dolls you'll see in stores, which are manufactured by Mattel, and tend to be pretty low on the budget and quality scale, definitely not the most exciting. And then there's the dolls manufactured actually by the Disney store, and that includes both their regular stock and the more expensive limited edition dolls that they release too. Integrity Toys is a company that makes dolls exclusively for adult collectors. These are very expensive and very exclusive, and in order to access the vast majority of their stock, you need to pay a membership fee. I do not recommend starting out with Integrity Toys if you're a beginner. They're definitely one you need to kind of work your way up to. And that's just talking about dolls that are available right now. Every brand I mentioned also has dolls that are now discontinued and only being sold secondhand. And even further than that, there's entire brands that are no longer being sold. At some point in your journey, being a doll collector, you're probably going to buy something secondhand. So I do have to offer some supplementary viewing. My video specifically over the fashion doll secondhand market. Sorry to redirect, I just don't want to derail this video by going in depth over something I've already covered before, but your biggest pals as far as buying dolls secondhand, they'll be eBay, Mercari, and Facebook Marketplace. Other secondhand sites sometimes have good deals too, like I've found pretty good prices on Depop of all places. Also, your local thrift stores, but that of course depends entirely on your area and the people living in it. There's also Facebook groups dedicated entirely to buying, selling, and trading dolls, which you'll see abbreviated as BST. I wish I could recommend those more strongly, but I don't really have good experiences with them. They're often pretty populated with people trying to scam or just vastly overvaluing what they have. So until you know how to very quickly identify scams and you feel confident in knowing what a certain doll is valued at, I can't really say I recommend those groups for anything other than gathering information. And those are qualities I can't really teach. They really do just come with experience. So now you've done your research and you've decided what brand or brands you want to collect. Now what? Here's the fun part. Building a wish list. And that's exactly what it sounds like. Go through the releases and decide which dolls you want. And sometimes a wish list is physical. I know a lot of collectors benefit from making actual lists to keep track of everything they want. And sometimes if you're less strict, it's just mental. Just thinking oh, when I go to Walmart in a few days, I'll be on the lookout for this one or this one. Because, and this is really important, so listen carefully, you do not need to buy everything you want all at once. You don't. I know what it's like when you first start collecting and you see all these experienced collectors with these huge collections, but in 98% of those cases, they've been collecting for basically their entire lives, and they built it very slowly, doll by doll. Doll collecting is not a race. It is not a marathon, not a sprint, not any physical activity. It is a completely indefinite process with no end. I plan to keep adding to this collection behind me literally until the day I die. And then my loved ones will have to find some kind of grand tomb to accommodate both me and all my little plastic women, like I'm some kind of Egyptian pharaoh. Half the fun of collecting comes from just watching your collection slowly build over time with all these things that you personally picked out and added to it. If you try to amass every single doll that you want instantly, I'll tell you right now, you're going to get burned out very, very quickly. And no one is going to judge you for having a small collection. No one that matters, anyways. Because all of us, every single doll collector, started with just a handful of dolls. And that circles back around to chapter 1, right? Because you should be buying dolls because you want them, not because you feel pressured to. Doll collecting is supposed to be fun. Hobbies, by nature, are supposed to be relaxing and fulfilling. If at any point you feel like your collection is stressing you out, take a step back and try to pinpoint why that is before you spend any more money on it. If you're someone who is easily overcome by the desire to, buy, I think a good system is to, like I said, build that wish list. And it doesn't have to be set in stone. It can be one that you add to as other dolls get released, or if you catch a glimpse of one you didn't know about before. But build that wish list and make a system. And what works for you works for you. Maybe it's purely time-based. $2 a week. That's your limit. Maybe it's a budget thing, say $50 a week or $100 a week, just set aside for dolls. It could be a reward system. Whatever you think is easiest for you and will hold you accountable, do it. Because it'll help each purchase feel more significant, and it'll always give you something to look forward to. And as time goes by, and you start to see your collection come to life, and you're not so overwhelmed by FOMO, you can start to be more lenient with yourself and start to make purchases more casually. Another thing that I think is important to say is that you do not need to be a completionist. A completionist is someone who, when they collect a brand, they try to buy every single doll that comes out for it. So if they collect Rainbow High, they want to buy every single Rainbow High doll that comes out. For the vast majority of collectors, that is simply not sustainable, and it forces you to buy dolls that you actually don't really want just for the sake of completing a collection. It can be very expensive and very stressful, and way more often than not is simply not worth it. For a select few people, it is feasible. They have the money and the space for it, but as a beginner, I just really do not think you need to be concerned with completionism. I think the most valuable, most important thing you can do is just buy the ones you want. Because for me, one of my favorite things about having a collection is the way you can look at it and see me in it. See the dolls that I chose because they appealed to me in some specific way. So, to summarize, do research on specific brands and find which ones appeal the most to you. It could be one brand, it could be several. Look through their releases and see which specific dolls you want and take note. These could be dolls that you could go out and buy right now, or they might be ones you'll have to buy secondhand. If you need to, incorporate some sort of system into your wish list to make sure you don't go overboard buying everything at once and burn yourself out. Make sure that purchases to your collection are deliberate, meaningful, and personal. Next, Chapter 3, Important Words and Terms. This is just a list of terms, words, doll lingo that I think are important for beginners to know. Because once you become more active in doll collecting communities, you'll see people using these words. And if you're anything like me, the act of admitting you don't know something gives you hives, so you're too afraid to ask. So I think these are in alphabetical order. If they're not, then don't correct me. First, acronyms. Specifically ones you'll see mostly on online listings for dolls secondhand. Now, Seeing usage of these is a pretty good indicator that you're buying from a fellow collector, or at the very least, someone who has a lot of experience selling toys, so they're very helpful to know. ISO, I'm seeking out or in search of. People will preface posts with this to show which dolls they're actively looking to buy, in case anyone who has the doll and wants to sell will respond to it. MIB and NIB, mint in box and new in box, meaning that the doll is like new and the packaging hasn't been opened or tampered with. MSRP, manufacturer's suggested retail price. This is what the company that makes the dolls suggests that they be priced at. Retailers may or may not follow that recommendation. If you're buying dolls secondhand, it's helpful to know what they were originally priced at. OOAK, one of a kind. This is a doll that is one of a kind, completely custom, can't be bought anywhere else. This is usually used to refer to dolls that are customized from existing ones into a new one, but sometimes companies manufacture their own one-of-a-kind dolls. Probably the one I see the most, for example, the Nicki Minaj Barbie. This is a product manufactured by Mattel, but she was not sold in stores. There was only one made in existence, hence one of a kind. Articulation. To put it simply, the level of articulation refers to how posable a doll is. The standard is 5 points of articulation: the neck, both arms at the shoulder, and both legs at the hip. But a lot of dolls in the last decade or so are more articulated, and you'll see joints like at the elbows or the knees for more posability. Sometimes also at the wrists and the ankles. The Barbie made-to-move body, which is considered the most articulated playline doll, has 22 points of articulation and is extremely posable. For some collectors, articulation is important, and for some, it isn't. Again, personal preference. Head sculpt. This is the specific facial characteristics of the doll. Essentially, the unique shape of her face and her head. They're also called head molds, but mold does refer specifically to like the casing that makes the sculpt, the mold. You'll see people saying both to mean the same thing, but if you want to be 100% correct, say head sculpt. This is most important when discussing Barbies because she has literally hundreds of unique head sculpts and they all have their own name. For example, the Superstar head sculpt is the face shape that was used for Barbie through the 80s and 90s. The face shape in the 2000s is called Generation Girl. The one used for Barbie now is called Millie. But there's also characters who all have their own sculpts they're associated with, as well as head sculpts that are primarily used for collector dolls. Like, there's a sculpt named Mackie, which was used on Barbies designed by Bob Mackie. When you see a Barbie that doesn't have, like, a specific name, but you see people call her, like, Kira or Shawnee, they're actually referring to the name of her head sculpt. There are other doll lines that give their characters unique head sculpts, like Monster High, but the system is not quite as in-depth as Barbie's. Also, along with head sculpt, you'll see people talking about a doll's screening. They go hand in hand, but they're different. Screening, which is also called a face-up sometimes, refers specifically to the doll's face. The eyes, the makeup, the lips, anything that is painted on top of the head sculpt is her screening. So, to take Bratz, for example, Bratz, for the most part, have the same head mold, with the only variation being a closed mouth or an open mouth. But the dolls have tons of different screenings or face-ups that differentiate them. Holy Grail. A holy grail doll is a doll that you really want, but for right now is unattainable. Maybe she's really rare, maybe she's really expensive, hard to find. Whatever the reason, you just can't buy her right now, and you might have to wait a very long time. But she's an ultimate goal. Most collectors have several dolls that they consider grails, and buying a grail doll is usually seen as like a big milestone in your collection. Playline versus collector. A playline doll is a doll that is produced for a general audience, mainly for children, so they're built to be played with. Playline dolls are the ones you'll see on shelves, though sometimes collector dolls are sold in stores too, and collector dolls are dolls that are aimed specifically at adult doll collectors, so they're a lot more expensive, made to be displayed rather than handled, and will be made with higher quality materials and sold in lower quantities. For example, the Monster High basic Frankenstein doll. Playline doll, they were $25 and available at multiple retailers, both physically and online in large quantities. The Monster High Haute Couture Frankie is a collector's doll. They were sold exclusively through the Mattel Creations website, priced at $75 and sold in a much smaller quantity. So once they sold out, that was it. They were gone. Sometimes releases will be labeled collector's edition, but still be playline. I know it's confusing. It's confusing for us too. But once you've collected both playline dolls and genuine collector dolls, it becomes pretty easy to differentiate them. Reproduction, sometimes abbreviated as repro. This refers to a doll that is made as a replica of a past release. These are usually considered less valuable than the original dolls, but are good if, you just want the doll and don't care much about that. And although they're replicas, they will always be slightly different from the original due to a change in materials or plastics or fabrics. So, for example, Mattel will frequently reproduce the original #1 Barbie, the swimsuit Barbie. She's an extremely iconic doll, so it makes sense that they would re-release her a few times, right? These reproduction dolls resemble the original doll in all the important ways, but they're not nearly as valuable. Bratz has been releasing a lot of reproductions lately. They recently reproduced the Girls' Night Out line from 2004, though the reproduction dolls are missing some of the extra outfits and accessories that the original release came with. Restyle and custom. A restyling is the act of taking a doll out of her factory outfit, that's the outfit she came packaged in, and giving her a new outfit. It can be clothes from another doll, ones you made yourself. It all counts as a restyle. This applies to hair too. So her factory hairstyle is the one that she's packaged in, and any alterations to it counts as restyling. A custom is taking it a step further. That is using the doll purely as a base for a completely custom creation. This usually involves removing the doll's face paint and painting your own in its place, or removing her hair and rerooting her. Rerooting meaning completely replacing the original hair with completely new hair. Scale. A scale is the size of a doll. Most fashion dolls are what is referred to as 1/6 scale. So that means roughly 1/6 the size of an average human being and around a foot tall. But of course, different dolls from different brands will have slight height differences. This is important if you're shopping for like custom clothes and furniture. If it's for a Barbie-sized doll, you'll want to make sure it's 1/6 scale. Scalping. This is when someone sells dolls that are not readily available at an extremely inflated price. Oftentimes, they're people who will buy all the available stock from a store, or they're people who got a hold of a product early and currently they're the only option available to buy it from. Do not buy from them. Like, just don't. It's not worth it. It's a scummy practice, and you're not doing yourself any favors by feeding into it. The term itself is a little contentious because it does use language that is, as you can imagine, pretty anti-indigenous. So far, no alternatives to the term have really taken off and become as widely used, so you will still see people saying it. Vintage. So the term vintage in doll collecting actually means different things to different people. For me, I use it to refer to dolls released before 1980. Some people use it to refer to dolls made 10 years ago. Some people exclusively use it to refer to, like, antique dolls. So what I'm trying to say is, don't get too caught off guard if someone has a different perception of what vintage is. We've all just kind of accepted that there is no central agreement on that fact. Chapter 4, the stigma. So you've taken the first step. You've started collecting. Maybe you have a few dolls now, but now here's one of the hardest parts, dealing with the stigma. Because unfortunately, not everyone is going to understand. But the good news is that, in my experience, most of this stigma doesn't come from a place of pure negativity. It comes from ignorance. There's a lot of weird ideas and misconceptions about what exactly doll collecting is, but most people, I think, are at least willing to try and understand. So it helps to have a level of patience. I understand it can be frustrating, but it really does help to just try and meet them halfway. It helps to educate them, show them videos like this one that prove that doll collecting is a huge community. Show them dolls like collector Barbies, the designer Bratz, integrity toys, expensive dolls that are meant specifically for adults, for doll collectors. Maybe they won't 100% understand everything right off the bat, but on some level, they do have to respect the fact that there is, in fact, an established community of people who are all doing the same exact thing. But sometimes there are those people that, no matter how hard you try, they're just not going to get it, and they're not going to make the effort. And those people, frankly, this is going to sound harsh, but they're not worth it. Because if they don't respect your hobbies, especially if they actively demean or insult your hobbies, that's an indicator of the kind of person they are, and that's not the kind of person you need in your life. And sometimes those people are family, so you can't really, kick them to the curb. Sometimes it's your parents, and that really sucks. But again, it comes down to the fact that you are not collecting for the approval of these people. You're doing it because you want to. And for every person in your life that disrespects your hobby, there are 100 doll collectors who are more than willing to befriend you. And that's really the best thing you can do if you ever feel alone as a collector, is to find a community. There's Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Discord, Tumblr, Instagram. All of these have thriving communities of fashion doll collectors. And I understand that it's hard to just traipse into a new community, but you have to remember, we're all in the same boat. We're all looking for fellow collectors to talk to. So as long as you're, a decent human being and you have a genuine love for dolls, you're gonna make friends there. Every community definitely has its own ecosystem to acclimate to. There's ones I prefer over others, like I'm way more active on Twitter than I am anywhere else. So again, it comes down to personal preference and just exploring and seeing what works best for you. Generally though, as long as you're respectful, The community is very welcoming to newcomers and willing to answer any questions you might have. But if you ever need reassurance, here's me telling you, you are not weird for collecting dolls. There's nothing wrong with it. You don't need to impress anyone. You don't need validation from anyone. You only need to do what makes you happy, and no one can tell you there's anything wrong with that. Chapter 5. Display, cleaning, and maintenance. So now you have your dolls, you're committed to being a collector, you're in it for the long haul. What now? Well, now you have to make sure your dolls stay pretty and perfect. And once you start collecting more, you'll probably develop your own routine of how you care for your dolls. So I'm just going to go over the absolute bare basics, the fundamentals of what you need to know, and I trust you to take it from there. So for display, bookcases and display cases are obviously your best bet. The ones I use are from the brand Furino. I get them from Amazon. I like them because they're pretty cheap, they're lightweight, and they're really easy to put together. Also, they're pink, which is important to me. But where your dolls go is completely up to you. As long as they fit and you can see them, usually they're good. Some ways to elevate your display, you can use risers. These are sold basically everywhere for pretty cheap, so you can display dolls at different heights. For dolls that don't come with their own display stands, I buy these from Amazon to use. They're extremely cheap and not durable at all, but they get the job done for most dolls. And once you display your dolls, the most important thing you can do, listen to me closely. I'm serious. I'm speaking directly to you. I am talking directly in your ear. Do not ignore this. If you forget every single other part of this video, that's fine, but do not, under any circumstances, forget what I'm about to say. Dust your dolls. I'm so serious. Please dust your dolls. I don't usually let my pets in here in the office. I always keep the door closed if I'm not in here. And even then, these ladies attract dust like no one's business. You need to dust. Don't let your girls get dusty, please. I just use a feather duster, like a regular old feather duster, and I go around and I just dust them. And then like once a month, I'll go through each shelf one by one with some furniture polish, and I'll clean the shelves off too. And now, where you display your dolls is also good to keep in mind. For one, do not put your dolls somewhere where they are exposed to direct sunlight. This will damage them and over time will cause discoloration. In some cases, it is actually reversible, but it's best to just not have to worry about that in the first place. Washing your dolls is also important too, especially if you buy them secondhand. You don't really know where they've been. And again, a lot of people have their own methods, but I usually use just a mix of baking soda and water to make like a paste. Take a toothbrush, obviously a clean one you don't plan on using, and just scrub very lightly all over the body. For clothes, hand wash in cold water. Just get a big bowl, use a little bit of dish detergent and swish them around, let them soak for a while, and just lay them out to dry. If your doll is a lot older or at a much higher price point, she might be a lot more delicate or might require more specialized care. If that's the case, before you try anything, reach out to one of those communities I mentioned earlier and see if anyone has any specific instructions for you. Or you can look on Google or YouTube and see if there is already a specific tutorial. Hair care is also extremely important. Now, here's where things get a little dicey, because different dolls will have different hair fibers that each have different ways of taking care of them. And I'll get to explaining the differences in a minute, but regardless of hair type, there's one universal basic thing that in like 95% of cases you can do to help maintain it: boil washing. And this is something that is best explained visually. So I'm going to link a video by the channel 1000 Splendid Dolls that is pretty old, but is an excellent tutorial that also goes over the specifics of how each hair type will interact with the boil washing. But essentially, a boil washing can be used to restore doll hair that has aged poorly. It can be used to straighten doll hair, to curl doll hair, because doll hair is plastic. They're plastic fibers, so you're using heat, hot water, essentially to reshape it. For most dolls, especially at the playline level, boil washing is the minimum you can do for them, and a lot of the time, it's enough. They don't really need anything extra, as long as you remember, every now and then, just give them a little spa day to keep their hair maintained and looking good. So for the different hair types, the ones you're most likely to encounter are saran, nylon, and polypropylene. There's also Kanekalon, which you might see if you're buying older dolls, but it's no longer manufactured. Saran hair is very dense and heavy and very shiny. Of all the hair types, it feels the most like plasticky to me, but it's also very silky too. You'll see saran mostly in dolls by Mattel, so Barbie and Monster High will have saran. It's usually used for more natural hair colors, but I have seen it in more color varieties recently. Nylon hair is very, very bright and colorful. That's one of the pluses of nylon, that it comes in basically any color you can imagine. It's very soft and smooth, and to me, often feels kind of waxy. Rainbow High and LOL OMG both primarily use nylon hair. Polypropylene hair is considered the cheapest and the least desirable hair fiber. Of all of them, it requires the most upkeep because it's prone to degrading and just disintegrating completely after a while. It feels very dry and straw-like, and it gets frizzy very easily, but it does hold its shape really well, and it comes in very bright, very fun colors. Kanekalon hair is, I don't know how else to describe it except fluffy. It literally reminds me of how my cat's fur feels. It's very soft, very light. It tangles and it mats extremely easily. Doll grade Kanekalon has been discontinued entirely though. There is still human grade Kanekalon, which American Girl uses, but if you're just buying dolls that are currently on shelves, you probably won't come across it. Being able to identify hair type by just touching it is a pretty valuable skill to have. It's one I honestly still struggle with, so it's a good idea, if it's within your means, to buy a doll that you know has polypropylene, one you know has nylon, one with saran, and just, feel them. Feel them and play with their hair and learn the difference firsthand. Because just explaining it verbally, I don't think gets the full picture across. And when it comes to just brushing a doll's hair, this is important. A lot of dolls will come with their own brushes, but I don't recommend using them. They'll be made of plastic, and brushing plastic hair with a plastic brush causes friction, which over time will damage the hair. Invest in a small metal brush or a comb. I use this one. I bought at Target a while back. It's meant for our generation dolls, but it works perfectly for any other doll I use it on. Chapter 6, Budgeting. This is probably the broadest category, which is why I saved it for last. Because everyone has a different financial situation. Everyone has different budgets. Everyone has different expenses. And everyone has different collections. But it's still important to talk about because there's no easy way to say it. But doll collecting is expensive. It's a very expensive hobby. You are going to spend money one way or another, and it's important to know how to manage that, especially if you're just starting out and this is basically like an added expense on top of everything else. For some people, this sort of thing comes very naturally. For others, not so much. The biggest tip I think I can give right off the bat is to never, ever compare yourself to others. There will always be someone way wealthier than you who can afford way more stuff. That's a fact of life. Comparing yourself to them, trying to catch up with them and their collection, it's not smart. It will only burn you out and make you very jealous and miserable, and that's not fun, right? Set goals that are realistic and within your means. Don't use anyone else as an example when it comes to budgeting. Tip number 2, patience, patience, patience. If you feel like you can't afford something at this very moment, no matter how badly you want it, there is no shame in waiting. And I know it sucks. I know it's easier said than done. But you have to keep in mind that for the vast majority of dolls, these are mass-produced in the hundreds of thousands. They're not going anywhere. If she's on shelves, she'll be restocked. And most dolls have a shelf life of at least a year. Best case scenario, she goes on clearance and you get her later for way cheaper. Worst case scenario, you have to look for her secondhand, but it still works out in the end. Now, sometimes dolls are, of course, limited edition or sold in smaller quantities. So if those are something that you feel like you'll be purchasing frequently, it's always good to have some money set aside just in case, like a doll fund, sort of. The amount is up to you, but it's just so if there's ever an announcement like, this limited edition doll is going up tomorrow morning, or there's a really good eBay listing you just found, you don't have to panic and scramble for a way to buy her. And I think that's good advice in general, is to just have any amount of money just set aside. And it doesn't have to be a fixed amount. You can keep adding to it when you have a little extra money here and there. So that way, even if you're not actively spending, you're still saving and putting it towards your hobby without it, eating your entire paycheck all at once. Tip number 3, essentials first. Always, no exceptions. Pay your rent, pay your bills, buy your groceries, buy any essential items you need, then worry about what dolls you want to buy. Tip number 4, take advantage of holidays where you get gifts. I'm so serious. Don't be too embarrassed to ask. If your parents, your partner, any friends and family know about your collection and have come to terms with it, now you know what to do for every birthday, every Christmas, all of that. Or if they don't, you could always ask for money that happens to be the same amount as a doll you want, and they don't have to know. Tip number 5. If you're ever in a position where you can't currently afford a new doll, but you're feeling that urge to buy, take some time with the dolls you have. Play with them, give them a big spa day, and dress them up in different outfits. Even if it's just a distraction to avoid impulse buying, do it. Tip number 6. And this one is a little serious. In a hobby that literally requires spending money constantly, the things like overconsumption, shopping addictions, compulsive spending, they're real, and they can be really difficult to deal with. There's no shame in being prone to these things, but it does mean you need to be extra careful and extra conscious of your habits. If you're ever at a low point, do not hesitate to seek out fellow collectors to talk to. because I promise they know exactly how it feels. And sometimes just being assured that you're not alone, that's enough to help. Chapter 7. Conclusion. If you're a beginner doll collector, I do not want this to be the only video you watch. And I don't just mean the only video of mine. I mean, use this purely as a jumping off point. This was by no means exhaustive. This is just the start. The rest is purely up to you. Just keep in mind, even with this guide, you're not going to be 100% ready to go. Everything truly really does come with experience. Even me, I'm still learning new things all the time when it comes to doll collecting. But you have to be willing to admit that you don't know everything. You have to be willing to learn new things, sometimes the hard way, and you have to be receptive to new experiences. As I've said all throughout this entire video, doll collecting is so incredibly personal. No two collections are alike. No two collectors have the same experience. So what you do from here on out, that's your journey. And genuinely, I wish you nothing but the best. If you have any further questions from things I didn't cover or didn't go into detail here, absolutely leave a comment. If I can't respond, I'm sure someone else will be happy to answer. And this video has already gone on way longer than I expected it to, so here's where I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to like and subscribe for any future fashion doll content. Now go out and get those dolls.